Every family has its own secrets, and no matter how hard we try, the truth always finds its way. Sometimes, one must not be afraid to sever old ties in order to forge new ones. But how much pain will be on that path? How many betrayals, tears, and losses? Every decision is like a bolt of lightning that tears through the darkness, and only you decide where to direct that light. Family is not always those who are close, but those who believe in you when everyone else has turned away. But how can you know when it's time to say enough? My earliest memories are filled with the warmth of my father's smile and the coziness of our little rented apartment. I remember how, in the evenings, when the daylight gave way to the evening shadows, he would come home from work and, without even taking off his shoes, scoop me up in his arms as if I were the most precious treasure. In his arms, I felt safe, as if the world outside our door could collapse, but we would remain invincible. That moment was always one of the most precious to me, and it gave my life a special atmosphere, warm and protected. My name is Conzetta, and until I turned 13, my life was perfectly ordinary, in the best sense of the word. My father, Bartolomeo, was the kind of person who, despite modest circumstances, always managed to create a festive atmosphere. He turned our tiny balcony into a miniature garden, where every plant was like a small miracle, lovingly nurtured by him. And our small living room, with its wallpaper that probably remembered more than one generation of tenants, became a fortress when the rain poured outside. We played board games, told each other stories, and no matter how strong the storm raged outside, it didn't matter to us. My mother, Sarah, was different. She always dreamed of something bigger, a house with a garden, with spacious rooms where we wouldn't have to economize on every square meter. Her dreams sometimes seemed unreachable to me, but that didn't stop her from being the best mom in the world. She knew how to create comfort, but her gaze was always fixed on the future, on the bright future she wanted to build for us. The differences between her and Dad seemed only to enhance the harmony in our family. Dad and I worked wonders in our small space, while Mom kept the dream of a better life, which she believed would inevitably come. Conzetta, darling, don't you want to spend the weekend at Grandpa's? My mom often asked. I would happily agree, not because I didn't want to be home, but because Grandpa Richard's house was like a second home to me. It was an old 2-story Victorian house with long hallways and creaky wooden floors. The house always smelled of freshly baked goods, and you could always find a quiet spot for reflection. Grandpa was a man of extraordinary wisdom. He always knew how to tell a story, making me feel like I was part of it. His tales of my father's childhood, about how he taught him to manage money, always intrigued me. I listened to him with rapt attention, because his words were more important than any textbook. Your mom needs some time alone with your dad, he often said when I came to visit. I understood that he and Mom had their own relationship that needed space to grow, and it didn't hurt me. On the contrary, I felt grown up, understanding. Grandpa was the one who could always offer advice. He wasn't just my friend, but also my mentor and support. During one such conversation, while we had breakfast on his porch, he told me, you know, Conzetta, your mom dreams of a big house, but perhaps one day you'll understand that what matters more is not the size of the house, but what reigns inside it. I nodded. At that age, it seemed like I understood everything. Our little apartment was filled with so much love that it filled every crack in the old walls. Despite all the flaws, it was a home where I felt good, where it was warm and cozy. But life has a way of changing when you least expect it. I was 13 when Dad started losing weight rapidly. At first, he joked about it, saying, finally, in shape, but his eyes. They revealed more than he wanted to say. He went to doctors more and more often, and Mom grew increasingly anxious. But he insisted it was just a phase. He would live, recover, and everything would go back to normal. But the illness was relentless. It was aggressive pancreatic cancer. It consumed him as quickly as a forest fire spreads through dry trees. In just a few months, my strong, energetic father became a shadow of his former self, and I could only look into his sick eyes, full of fear and pain. Mom tried to hold everything together, but I could see how she was falling apart from the inside. The last conversation with Dad is forever etched in my memory. He was lying in a hospital bed, his hand barely able to grasp mine, but he whispered, "Take care of your mom for me, princess." And, as if preparing to pass all his knowledge and strength to me, he added, "Let Grandpa guide you. He's wiser than all of us put together." Those words became my final promise. A year after Dad's death, it felt like I was living in a fog. My entire life turned into a shapeless mass with no bright colors or clear boundaries. Mom fell into such a deep depression that she could barely look at me. Sometimes, I felt like I reminded her too much of him, and she just couldn't bear it. Thank God Grandpa Richard was there. He became my rock, my anchor in the stormy sea that our life had turned into. In his house, I felt stability, even if it was only temporary. Life there was no longer just a temporary shelter. It became my new normal, my refuge. Every morning, I woke up in the room that had once been my father's. His old photographs hung on the walls, and his childhood trophies stood on the shelves, everything that had once made him a real person, loved and alive. Grandpa made sure I didn't fall behind in my studies, helped me with homework, and comforted me with his stories and laughter. He did everything he could to fill the void that both of my parents had left. One had gone, and the other was consumed by grief. Mom would occasionally call, but her voice always seemed so distant and detached, as if she were on the other side of the world, not in a nearby city. Her visits became increasingly rare, and our conversations shorter and more casual. We barely met each other's eyes, and even when she stayed for a few hours, her presence in the house felt like a shadow gliding across the walls, leaving behind only the scent of perfume and a sense of alienation. I learned not to expect more. Expectations only bring extra pain. And then, a year and 2 months after Dad's death, everything changed. Mom appeared on the doorstep of Grandpa's house one sunny Saturday morning. I hardly recognized her. She was no longer the grieving widow in black. On the contrary, she was radiant, as if she had come back to life. A bright yellow dress, a new haircut, and her face glowing with joy. It seemed like she was someone completely different, someone foreign. "Conzetta, darling, pack your things, you're going home," she said, bouncing on her heels like a teenager, smiling so brightly that her eyes sparkled and her lips stretched wide. I glanced at Grandpa. He was as surprised as I was. We exchanged silent glances, and he nodded, as if silently signaling that he couldn't oppose her decision. Returning to our old apartment felt strange. Mom chattered nonstop, talking about everything and nothing at all. It was like sitting next to a stranger who just happened to look like my mother, but whose words, actions, and even gaze felt foreign to me. The shock I felt when we entered the apartment was indescribable. In our little living room stood a tall man and a girl who looked about 3 years younger than me. They both smiled at us with such awkwardness that I felt a chill run down my spine. "Conzetta, meet David and his daughter Alba. David is my fiancé, and Alba will be your new sister," Mom said, almost dancing around these people. David and Alba tried to smile, but it was so forced that I felt a cold shiver down my back. "We're getting married soon," Mom added with genuine excitement in her voice, but I could hardly believe it. How did this happen? When did it happen? Why didn't anyone tell me? Mom, as always, waved it off. "We've been seeing each other for a while." I didn't tell anyone about our relationship. You know how people can be, jealous and judgmental. It was better this way. I sat down in my old room, barely noticing that it had been renovated. It felt so unnatural. My hands trembled as I took out my phone and called Grandpa. He answered immediately. I could barely say, "Mom has a fiancé. She's getting married." My voice was barely audible through the tears, but that was all I could manage to say. Grandpa arrived 20 minutes later. I could hear him speaking to Mom in the living room. His voice was hoarse and restrained when he asked, "How could you do this, without telling anyone, without telling your own daughter?" Mom's voice was defensive. I decided to start a new life. Bartolomeo would have wanted me to be happy again. He wouldn't want me to keep wasting away in depression. I could hear the uncertainty in her words, but she still pressed on. Grandpa was silent, then quietly said, "I hope you'll be happy, Sarah, but don't forget, you have someone who needs you too." 3 months earlier, everything hadn't been as complicated. I continued to live between two worlds, between the evenings with Grandpa and the things I had to endure in the apartment, which had turned into a rented stage for a family drama. Mom became more and more distant, as if she were only a shadow of the woman I remembered. She seemed to dissolve into her new role, wiping away everything old, changing herself to fit someone else's expectations, and distorting her own past. The wedding was a complete disaster, but maybe that was just how it seemed to me. From the very beginning, when we sat at the table, I felt like something was missing. In the photos on the walls of their new house, in Mom's clothes, and even in her voice, it all felt like a mask, behind which I couldn't see anything real. Mom was happy, and that was the most important thing, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that she had forgotten about me. With Alba, Mom immediately began a behavior I couldn't understand. Each day, she became more and more privileged, while I, almost intentionally, was made to feel like a secondary figure. As soon as Alba mentioned her desires, Mom would break down all barriers to fulfill them. Alba's dreams became the priority, while my requests, which seemed perfectly reasonable, were shoved into a corner where they went unheard. When I asked for even a little time with Mom, she pretended not to understand me. As if we could no longer just spend an evening together like we used to, because Alba needed more of her attention, more of her care. Mom, more and more immersed in the role of the perfect mother, didn't notice how I was disappearing from her life. How I was becoming nothing more than a shadow standing in the background. I waited for something to change, but everything just got worse. On the day of the wedding, when Mom was glowing more than ever, I stood next to her, trying not to cry. I held the bridesmaid dress, but at that moment, I felt like nothing more than an observer. Mom was so absorbed in Alba that I barely received a glance from her, barely heard her voice when she greeted me. I was no longer part of her new world, just someone who didn't fit in. When Grandpa came on the wedding day with a gift, I noticed how Mom started demanding more, demanding space and attention. Just a few minutes after the check was handed over, I overheard their conversation. She was talking about how now, with the family complete, she needed more. She needed the apartment to be for everyone, for them, for the new family. And even though it seemed to me that I was still part of that space, I couldn't help but feel that her words were just another attempt to push me out. Grandpa, calm as always, seemed to have accepted it. But in his eyes, I saw disappointment. He didn't want this. He understood that something was wrong in my life, but maybe he didn't know how to fix it. When I found myself back in my room, in the empty house, I realized that I was now an outsider. I no longer fit into their new reality. I sank deeper into myself, trying to preserve even a shred of my dignity. I spent more and more time at Grandpa's, where I didn't have to pretend. There, I could be myself, even if it was just a brief escape from reality. When I announced that I had been accepted into university, I felt the tension in the air become palpable. Everyone was silent, and the only thing I heard from Mom was a soft voice. "Conzetta, maybe it would be better if you started working instead of wasting time on college?" This was a reverberation of what had happened before, when I realized that I no longer mattered to my mother. I stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Dad set up a college fund for me before he died. He always wanted me to get a higher education." Her words cut through me like sharp knives, tearing at my memories and hopes. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, as if trying to justify what she'd said. There was worry in her eyes, but she tried to appear confident. David and I talked, and we think it would be better to use that money for Alba's education. She's incredibly talented, the best in her class and at everything she does. She'll get a good university education to fully realize her potential, she said, as if this were her own idea, not just another manipulation. David, standing nearby, nodded knowingly, adding, "She's shown outstanding academic abilities. This would be the right decision." As if his words weren't empty formalities, but a completely logical and justified conclusion. My hands trembled with anger. I tried to swallow the bitter lump in my throat, but I couldn't. It was a blow, as though someone had struck me in the stomach. Everything I had ever considered mine, everything that was left to me from Dad, the college fund, his final gift to me, was now being taken away. And now I was being told I didn't need it. That they could just take it and give it to Alba. My stepsister. "This is my money," I shouted, my voice shaking with fury. "Dad left it specifically for my education. You can't just give it to Alba." My words seemed to hang in the air, but Mom didn't stop. She whispered quietly, looking at me with an expression full of false sorrow, "Don't be selfish, Conzetta. Alba needs it. Alba is your sister." I erupted like a volcano. All those months of silence, enduring, holding in the pain, now came crashing down on her with full force. Mom cried, but I saw the manipulation in her tears. I saw how she used every moment to make me give in. I felt everything inside me snap, like I was losing the last thread that connected me to this family. Everything I had once called home was crumbling before my eyes. "How dare you, Mom?" I screamed, standing up so abruptly that the chair tipped backward, clattering to the floor. "These are the last funds left to me from Dad. You gave her everything else, my room, your attention, your love, but you can't take this. I won't let you." Inside me, there was such rage that I could barely breathe. These were the last remnants of my fight, my attempt to be heard. But Mom no longer heard me. She just kept lamenting my selfishness, as though I were to blame for her failure to see how much pain I had endured. The argument ended with a door slamming, and the apartment grew even colder. Silence filled the space, heavy and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. We didn't speak unless it was absolutely necessary. Alba walked by, smirking at me. David didn't even look in my direction. Everything I did seemed like an empty gesture, for everyone except me. When graduation day came, I wasn't surprised to find only Grandpa in the audience. He was the only one who was truly happy for me, who took pride in my achievements. And his greeting was loud and sincere, like never before. But for me, it meant far more than any congratulations I could have received from my new family. He was the one who truly believed in me. I packed all my belongings into 3 cardboard boxes and an old suitcase I once used for trips with Dad. Grandpa helped me load them into his car, and as we left the apartment, he said, "Your room is always ready for you, dear. It always has been, and it always will be." His words were the only comfort. I didn't look back when we drove away. There was nothing left to hold me in that apartment. University life became my true escape. I threw myself into my studies, determined to do everything I could to make my father and Grandpa proud of me. Business and finance courses consumed me. I realized I was excelling in these areas, and I imagined how Dad would have smiled if he had seen how I was developing. I called Grandpa to share my new knowledge, and as always, he listened intently, telling me about finance as if he were my teacher. But with each passing month, I noticed Grandpa growing weaker. His wit and energy were fading, and his voice was growing more tired. During my visits home, I noticed him wince when he stood, how he lost his breath when he thought I wasn't looking. He never said anything to me out loud, but I saw it. "It's just age," he would say when I asked about his health. But I was worried. I started calling him twice a day instead of once, and every week, as soon as I could, I would visit him just to sit with him in the kitchen, drink tea, and talk about everything and nothing, just like we used to. I stared at her, unable to believe my own eyes. My heart was pounding in my chest, and everything inside me felt like a chaotic mess. But what struck me the most was the cold, calculating cruelty with which she spoke. Mom stood in the doorway, wearing the same black dress as at the funeral, but now her expression was completely different. No longer grief, no sorrow. In her eyes sparkled a bright glimmer of triumph, as though she had just won her personal battle. But who had been her enemy? Me? When she called, I didn't immediately pick up the phone. It had been 4 years since I left home. Mom hadn't called, and I wasn't planning to make the first move. But something inside me compelled me to answer. Her voice was steady, as though she were just delivering news. She told me Grandpa had died. Last night, she said. I remember almost nothing of what happened next. I only remember how the phone slipped from my hand, and I, like a statue, just sat there, not knowing what to do. In that moment, I lost what was left of myself. Grandpa was the last person who supported me. And now he was gone. 2 days later, it was Thursday. I was on my way to the funeral, but I couldn't believe it was actually happening. The funeral home was just as Grandpa would have chosen, restrained but elegant, with large windows letting in the light. I arrived early, wearing a black dress that was too tight, just like everything around me. The world without Grandpa felt too small. I thought I would see Mom, David, and Alba, but they weren't there. Instead, I met Mr. Harrison, an old friend of Grandpa's from the banking world. He said they were running a little late, and then, awkwardly, added that the service would begin without them. He didn't even mention who had made that decision. During the service, I sat in the front row, feeling my bitter tears blur my vision. But none of my emotions could suppress the anger that was inside me. Because the moment I heard the back door open and they rushed in, I realized this wasn't just a funeral. It was a real confirmation that for my mother and her family, I no longer existed. She sat in the furthest corner with David and Alba, not once looking at me. Mom didn't even spare me a glance. She didn't waste a single moment playing her part. And it hurt, because even in that moment, when I needed support, she could think only of herself, of her interests. In her eyes, there was no pain, no regret. It was like some minor bureaucratic task that needed to be carried out. Even at the moment when the last of my close ones was supposed to be mourned, she didn't forget her advantage. When the funeral was over, I went home. To Grandpa's house, which had become my home over the past 4 years. But what I saw shocked me to the core. Outside the house, there were trash bags, ripped open, and my things were spilling out. My clothes, books, photos, everything was discarded like garbage. I stood there, stunned. It was so shameless that I couldn't say anything. I still had the key to the house in my hand. I walked up to the door, tried to put the key in the lock, but it wouldn't turn. The lock had been changed. I stood there, shaking, with the key in my hand, unable to comprehend how this could happen. And then, suddenly, the door swung open. Mom stood in the doorway, wearing the same black dress as at the funeral, but now her face was completely different. It wasn't grief. It was triumph. She looked at me with the expression of a victor, her eyes devoid of any regret. She stood there like the owner, and it was more painful than everything that had happened before. "Oh, good that you're here to take your things," she said, as if she were doing me a favor. "This is my house now. Dad is dead, so I'm the rightful heir. I've already changed the locks, and we're moving in tonight." I couldn't believe my ears. Her words sliced through me like sharp knives. Couldn't you have waited a few days? Couldn't you have left my life untouched for just one more day? No, she couldn't. This was her victory, and she wasn't willing to delay her game for even a moment for some feelings. I couldn't hold it in any longer. My hands trembled as I began gathering my things. Mom stood in the doorway, her eyes never leaving me. She was like a guard, watching my every move, ready to point out the slightest mistake I might make. And just as calmly as always, she spoke again. Alba always wanted your old room. Now it will be hers. The ride back to the college dorm was filled with tears and disbelief. Every turn, every stop in the taxi felt like some horrible slowing of time. I couldn't even clearly understand what was happening around me. The world had shrunk to the size of a cold, monotonous box with no room for feelings. My roommate helped me carry everything, not asking any questions. I didn't want to talk, I had nothing to say. She just silently packed her things and left me alone with this unbearable burden. A week later, I received a call from Miss Cattanio's law firm. It was Mr. Anderson, Grandpa's notary. "We need you to come for the reading of the will on Thursday at 10 a.m., he said. I agreed, even though I didn't see the point in what might be said. Mom had made it clear that she had claimed her place in this game, and I was no longer important to her. When I arrived at the notary's office on the appointed day, the atmosphere was cold and official. Mom, David, and Alba were already there, sitting like queens in leather chairs, as always, confident in their righteousness. Alba lazily examined her manicure, and David, as usual, was absorbed in his phone. Mom's eyes narrowed when she saw me, and her voice became loud and sharp, like a knife. "What are you doing here?" she asked, loud enough for everyone in the office to hear. "You clearly don't belong here, we're dealing with family matters." It felt like a blow, but I stayed silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Anderson adjusted his glasses and began reading the document in front of him. He spoke in formal phrases, and I hardly listened until I heard the word consent. "To my beloved granddaughter, Consent Cattanio, I bequeath my home along with all its contents, and all my savings, including the account containing $475,000. For a moment, the room fell into dead silence, as if everything had frozen in anticipation. This moment lasted only a second, but it felt as though time had stopped forever. My mother's gaze was stunned, and her lips trembled as she snatched the will from Mr. Anderson's hands, unable to believe her eyes. "What is this? This is impossible." Her voice was almost hoarse. She scanned the document again and again, searching for any mention of her name. But it wasn't there. Mr. Anderson didn't change his expression. "Mrs. Waters, your father's wishes are perfectly clear. He leaves everything to Consent. There are no provisions for you in the will." His voice was calm and assured, as though he had just read a recipe for pie. Mom went pale, then her face flushed red with rage. She started manipulating her words, claiming her father had been poisoned against her, that this was impossible, that she would sue. But Mr. Anderson only replied that the will had been signed 6 months ago, notarized, and no legal maneuvering could change it. It was a solid document. I hadn't expected Mom to switch gears so quickly. Her rage seemed to dissipate, and tears appeared in her eyes. She turned to me, her face contorted with despair. "Please, darling," her voice became soft, pleading. "Sweetheart, we have nowhere to go. We gave up the apartment, we've moved all our things. Are you really just going to abandon us?" I remained silent, unable to respond. On the street, where we stood, I realized her words didn't matter. It was just a manipulative tactic to make me feel pity. Mom had always been good at playing on my emotions, but now I could no longer overlook it. "How could you throw my things on the lawn when Grandpa hasn't even been laid to rest yet?" I asked quietly but firmly. "How could you try to steal the money meant for my college? How have you treated me these last 4 years?" My words hit her like hammers, pounding into her face. She tried to justify herself, but I interrupted her. This is your problem, not mine. I turned and left, not looking back. I suggest you start looking for a new apartment, my words echoed in her ears. I walked down the street, not looking back, feeling as if the weight of the past years, like a heavy burden, had finally slipped off my shoulders. I went to Grandpa's house, my home, but when I approached the door, I couldn't get inside. I took out my phone and called a locksmith, explaining the situation. When he arrived, I showed him my recently notarized property documents. I am the legal owner of this house, I said, and the locksmith, without asking unnecessary questions, got to work. I need you to open these locks and replace them with new ones. I want to be the only one with keys, I added, feeling something inside me click for the last time. Everything that had happened was becoming final. I went inside the house, and while the locksmith worked, I gathered the things belonging to Mom, David, and Alba. All their things were scattered around, just as I had found mine. I gathered it all into trash bags, just like they had done with my things when I wasn't home. The only thing I could do was return everything to where it belonged, on the porch. When the locksmith finished and handed me the new keys, I gripped them tightly and, without saying a word, took their bags out to the porch. I arranged them neatly, as though I were placing my last memories of what had once been home. The symmetry of the situation didn't escape me. Their things now stood where my own had been only a few days ago, a haunting echo of what had transpired. It was almost a mystical moment, as if time itself had decided to close the loop, not allowing us to escape. The evening sun, streaming through the windows, bathed everything around me in soft golden hues, creating an incredible contrast with the harshness of what was happening. I stood in the living room, looking at the old chair where Grandpa always liked to read the newspaper in the mornings, and felt something inside me tighten with bitterness and exhaustion. The sound of Mom's car pulling into the driveway was familiar. The piercing, nervous screech of the brakes, I recognized it immediately. She always drove with such tension, as if every maneuver was a victory in some battle. And now, that sound became an ominous prelude to what I already knew. Everything would be just as it always had been. I wasn't mistaken. Mom, David, and Alba, just as expected, arrived, knowing they couldn't change anything but still trying. When they appeared on the doorstep, I didn't move, I didn't step back. I stood like a stone pillar, ready to absorb the blow. Mom was red with fury, David, as usual, looked like he had swallowed something sour, and Alba was already crying, theatrically waving her arms as if her whole world had collapsed. Mom literally stormed onto the porch and, not hiding her anger, shouted, "How dare you?" Her words were filled not so much with a question as with an accusation. And in that moment, I understood that in her world, only the one who exerted pressure was right. The one who wasn't afraid to set the terms. But I wasn't ready to give up. "Actually, I can," I replied, remaining unshaken despite the storm of emotions boiling in my chest. "This is my house. Legally and justly now. You need to take your things and leave." The response was immediate, more tears from Alba, more hysteria, more accusations, but I no longer felt the pain they tried to provoke. I knew that at that moment, my words were the truth, and they couldn't do anything about it. Mom didn't believe it, but she still started collecting the bags, realizing that her manipulations wouldn't work. I silently watched their commotion as they tried to justify their behavior, but I could no longer be the one who listens and accepts their excuses. I could no longer be the one to bring them back into my life as if nothing had happened. No, I had become someone else. When they finally loaded the last bags into the car, I coldly said, "You are not my daughter." There was a hint of betrayal in her voice, but I only felt a faint sadness. Mom probably never understood that I was no longer the person she had always seen me as. I stood on the porch and watched as their car disappeared around the corner. "You should think carefully before giving up your apartment," her voice seemed to echo beyond this moment. But I didn't feel sorry. 6 months passed. I was nearing the end of my final semester and about to graduate with honors. The house was being rented out, which helped me save some money. Grandpa had always said that this would be better for me. But most importantly, I had learned to make decisions on my own, based on my own principles, not on what others had imposed on me. I found his letter in a textbook when everything was already behind me. "My dear Consett," it began. I read it several times, and each time Grandpa's words seemed to grow more significant. He knew that I would have to go through a lot, and perhaps it was his wisdom that helped me not lose myself. "You did everything right. You are strong. Take care of yourself and the home you deserve. Now, here I am. The home I left for myself has become my place of strength. I have accepted it not only as property but also as a symbol of finally understanding my own worth. And, most importantly, I have learned to be who I am, regardless of who others tried to make me."